brace yourself. The shockwaves from the Trump administration's tariff blitz are reverberating through the entire US economy and the world. Few policy moves generate as much confusion and fierce debate, but here's why you can't afford to tune out. These tariffs haven't just shaken up trade relationships. They've brought about the biggest tax increase on Americans in decades and left households, businesses, and governments scrambling to adapt. But here's where it gets controversial. Some argue it's a bold step to restore American industry, while critics warn we're playing with fire. Let's unravel this economic whirlwind, what it means for you, and why it could reshape global trade as we know it. The tariff turmoil. What's really happening? Since President Trump's return for a second term, the US has launched a dizzying array of tariffs within the first 100 days, so many that even experts struggle to keep up. These aren't just minor incremental changes. Invoking emergency powers, the administration imposed tariffs not only on China, Canada, and Mexico, citing crises like migration and crime, but also on almost every trading partner, referencing trade imbalances and unfair practices. Most notably, the so-called reciprocal tariffs include both targeted country rates, now largely on hold, and a sweeping 10% tariff on all imports. This analysis zeroes in on policies in place as of May 1st, 2025, but warns that the tariff regime remains unpredictable. But that's not all. Tariff announcements have been riding a roller coaster of reversals, exemptions, and ever-changing threats. This constant uncertainty layers on top of the economic jolt, making it even harder for anyone to plan ahead. International responses have varied, with some nations retaliating, pausing, or threatening countermeasures of their own. The US and China, for instance, are now locked in a tit-for-tat cycle, hurling tariffs as high as 125 to 145% at one another, teetering on the edge of what could become a virtual trade embargo between the two largest economies on Earth. Sector-specific tariffs add further tension. Cars, auto parts, steel, aluminum, and potentially semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and more are now facing new barriers. Importantly, the overall average US imports being tariff rate has skyrocketed to roughly 25%, an order of magnitude higher than the average over the past 50 years, which lingered below 4%, even dipping to 1.5% before Trump's first term. Don't overlook this. Even if households and businesses eventually adjust purchases to reduce the burden, the scale of today's tariffs is an economic shock not seen in generations. And it's not just the US. Any country with strong trade ties to America is feeling the pressure. Unclear objectives, uncertain outcomes. A key point of contention is the administration's endgame. Is the aim to extract trade concessions, fund big income tax cuts, revitalize manufacturing jobs? The mixed signals make it nearly impossible for negotiators or the public to discern a clear direction. Foreign leaders, frustrated by wavering US goals, are repeatedly left in the dark. The stakes for US consumers and taxpayers. Here's a jaw-dropper. The first 100 days under the new tariffs have resulted in the largest effective tax hike for ordinary Americans in a generation. Estimates from institutions like Yale's Budget Lab peg the short-term household blow at nearly $4,900, eventually falling to $2,600 as people adjust buying habits. The Tax Policy Center and University of Pennsylvania's Penn Wharton budget model offer similar projections, with potential consumption dipping by around 3%. To put that in perspective, for the average US household, these tariffs may represent a greater tax hit than federal income taxes themselves. Middle and low-income families are especially vulnerable. Income tax reductions from extending current policy are dwarfed by the new costs from tariffs. For most, the promised gains of tax cut extensions, about $1,000 for a median family, and only avoiding a tax hike, not increasing income. Don't come close to matching the extra expense of new tariffs. But here's what most people miss. The shift from progressive income tax cuts, which benefit higher earners, to broad-based consumption taxes like tariffs, which weigh heavily on those lower down the income ladder, is inherently regressive. Simply put, the less you earn, the larger the proportion of your paycheck eaten up by tariffs, while wealthier households who save more are less impacted. As an example, imagine a policy where tariffs hold steady at 10% for most goods, that imports from China face a 60% penalty. Even if Congress extends the Trump-era tax cuts, the lowest income households could see after-tax incomes drop by more than 5% just from tariff impacts, while only the richest might come out ahead. If cuts in government spending are added, the inequality grows even sharper. Shortages, disruptions, and empty shelves. Tariffs don't only raise prices. The chaos in policy rollouts means many consumers are facing shortages as shipping routes dry up. Recent reports from US ports show drastic drops in cargo, threatening to leave store shelves emptier, a scenario eerily reminiscent of the COVID-19 supply nightmares. What about US workers and businesses? Tariff supporters claim higher costs for consumers are a fair price to pay for bringing back manufacturing jobs. But history and a raft of studies suggests otherwise. On the whole, earlier tariffs led to more job losses than gains, particularly because many American producers rely on imported parts and materials to stay competitive. Steel tariffs, for instance, may have preserved steel jobs, but at the expense of far greater job losses in industries that depend on affordable steel. Exporters are hit from all sides: rising input costs, retaliatory tariffs abroad, and shrinking international markets. Farmers, airplane makers, and other major exporters have all voiced distress over cancelled orders and falling revenue. The ripple effects go deeper as resources shift within the economy. Not all displaced workers or investments can be easily repurposed. In effect, the US ends up producing things it's less efficient at, sacrificing innovation and economic growth. Macroeconomic domino effect. Already, the data points to deepening trouble. Consumer confidence is down. Business uncertainty is up. Forecasts are seeing an elevated risk of recession, and many point to the tariff shock as the pivotal factor. The Federal Reserve now faces a nasty dilemma: how to navigate rising prices, inflation, while growth slows. The classic recipe for stagflation. To make matters even more contentious, President Trump has openly questioned the independence of the Fed, even threatening to replace its chairman. Such moves rattle financial markets further, especially when combined with a disregard for court rulings and existing legal norms, as multiple ongoing lawsuits underscore. Layer on ballooning federal deficits and debt despite a strong pre-existing economy, and the administration's push for further tax cuts, and the US faces the risk of